Peace to the saints. This lecture is an introduction to Marquettism. Not what is Marquettism about, but rather why do we need Marquettism? What is the issue in culture that requires we create a new culture? Well, let's consider this. In years of yore, culture came from the tribe. If you were Igbo or Han, Chinese, you shared a culture with those persons who looked like you. It involved a language, a manner of speech, a way of dressing, a religion, mores, myths, a way of behaving, hierarchies, traditions, rituals. And these all came at the tribal level. That's what created your culture. In the modern society, we have high levels of integration, heterogeneous societies in the West, wherein you have a mix of different races, different ethnicities. And this started the breakdown of culture when peoples began to integrate. What started to create the spread of perverse culture was the advent of the television. Kind of starting in the 1960s, we started to have cultural revolution. And then coming in even heavier today, we have social media. And what these projection platforms, that is the television, the radio, social media, these platforms allow the individual to project their message, their ideology, their filth, their misinformation widely. And what happens is you start to have a breakdown in culture because now people are getting all of this information, some of it misinformation, and they're adopting new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving, new ways of believing that are not as good. And today, if we're being honest, our culture is largely created globally by Hollywood. And the media, which is controlled by the Hollywood LGBTQ gay mafia, which is hyper-liberal, is spreading a message of confusion. They have boys thinking that they're going to grow up and become women instead of men. And vice versa, they have girls thinking that they're born in the wrong body and they want to be guys. And what happens when you as a boy don't know yourself and you don't develop into a man, or you as a girl don't really understand yourself and you don't properly develop into a woman, you still have sexual desire. And that primitive instinct causes you to sleep with one another as a male and female. And because you are both broken and then you have children, you create what's called a broken family. And broken families that have broken children create a broken society, which is an unhealthy, sick society, an unpleasant place to be in. That is the society that we live in today throughout the West, Australia, Europe, UK, United States. We're seeing increasing numbers of broken families in these societies that are heterogeneous especially. So this is why we need global culture. And just to explain a little more why culture is so important, consider this infographic that I have here. And it basically identifies how culture is the driving force of how you make decisions. For example, me, I'm an American. And as an American, I'm wearing a t-shirt. I didn't think about if I would wear a t-shirt. I didn't think, is there any other kind of shirt to wear? No. In America, we wear t-shirts. So I put on a t-shirt when it's warm outside. But if I was in Morocco, for example, I wouldn't be wearing a t-shirt. I might be wearing a jalaba. Why? Because the culture there is common that men my age would wear a jalaba. So I'd probably be wearing something in line with my culture. And culture is something, when there's a dominant culture, it causes you not to question things. It causes you not to think. You rely on the culture. So I just put on a t-shirt because I'm an American. We wear t-shirts. If I was in Morocco, I might put on a jalaba and not think anything of it because in the Moroccan culture, historically, we wear jalabas. Nothing wrong with it. Don't need to question it. If it's a good culture, fantastic. You'll have an easier time making decisions that lead you to prosperity and health. If it's a bad, wicked culture, the dominant culture, then you're going to be led to decisions that will lead you to ill health and unhappiness. In the West, we have a culture of alcoholism and drinking when you go out for Friday night or Saturday night, or when you go to happy hour with your colleagues. That is something that destroys you. So that's why we need to consider culture. So just considering this graph here, there's really three driving forces of decision making. Let's look at three subsections of the human population if we're chopping it up by IQ. to say that there are those who are below average IQ/EQ, IQ being intelligence, which is largely fixed, EQ being emotional intelligence, which you can modify at some level using your intelligence. So those who are below average IQ and EQ, and if we want to think of an archetype for this person, so just to have someone in your mind, think of an individual who is suffering from mental retardation or an individual who has severe autism. So that would be the archetype for the person who has below average IQ and EQ. Now, if you want to think of an average person, just think of the average person you see out in the society. And then if you want to think of a high IQ person, think of perhaps an Elon Musk figure. Now, there are three things that are going to drive decision making. And number one is, I'm not saying them in order. The order changes depending on your IQ, but there are three options. Number one is primitive instincts, meaning your desire to have sex, your desire to sleep, your desire to eat. Basic primitive things that even a caveman wants to do. You're driven to do it biologically. Sex is going to be on your mind, right? So those are your primitive instincts. Then there's the dominant culture, meaning the way of your world, the way of your society, what most people are doing. That is going to drive a level of behavior because you feel stigmatized if you go against it. The other thing that drives behavior is your IQ and EQ, meaning your ability to look at a situation, use your intellect to understand or interpret, and then make the decision that's most advantageous for you as an individual using your IQ and EQ. Those are the three different things that human beings use to drive decision making. Now, here's the thing, depending on your IQ, there are different drivers will drive your decision making. So for example, if you're in the below average IQ category, this group of people will basically first utilize their primitive instincts. This is why if you look at someone who's suffering from severe mental retardation, though they might not be able to think coherently to, survive independently on their own, which is why they have to have caretakers. One thing they don't have to use their IQ to do is you'll notice that these individuals are very much so sexually inclined. Often autistic males or mentally retarded males, they still masturbate. No one has to teach them how to do that. They don't have to take a course on it or go to school to learn. It's a natural, primitive instinct. And this is something that they'll do when they're in public even, because they don't have the IQ to think through if this is a good idea, nor are they intelligent or socially connected enough to be, aware of the dominant culture, which would tell them that masturbation in public is not proper. So if you're below average IQ, you're more inclined to first go by your primitive instinct, which might be an instinct for sex, an instinct for eating, an instinct for sleeping, an instinct for violence, protecting yourself or, safety. So primitive instincts rule those with low IQ. So the second thing that will influence a person with below average IQ, once they've appealed to their primitive instinct, if it's not a situation that relates to food, sex, or the need to protect themselves, then they'll go with whatever the dominant culture is doing. So for example, if I was a below average IQ person and everyone in my ghetto is telling me that I need a pair of Gucci shades, and I go to a store and I see a selection of sunglasses, I'm going to pick the Gucci shades because that's what everyone else is doing. I'm just going to go with the dominant culture. The third thing that the low IQ person this is the third thing they'll appeal to, is insufficient intelligence, meaning their brain. They'll use their own brain and try to think through the situation. But remember, they first look at what their primitive nature tells them to do. If it's not a situation relating to primitive instincts of sex, sleep, self-protection, things like that, then they'll ask, what is the dominant culture doing? They'll look around and see what everyone else is doing and basically play follow the follower, right? Not follow the leader, but follow the follower. And if this is something where they can't get a clue from observing others on what to do, then they'll use their insufficient intelligence. And because they're below average in intelligence, generally they'll make an errant decision, right? A decision that could be harmful to you or I or even themselves. Fortunately, low IQ individuals are generally ones who have caretakers or are very, much so a smaller part of the human population. Now let's talk about people with average IQ. This is like 85% of the population, right? These are the overwhelming majority of persons that you see in the society. These are the kids who are in class with you, right? So average IQ people They make decisions firstly based on dominant culture. Why? Because people with average IQ, they've successfully made it through the schooling system, elementary, middle, and high school, and therefore they've been conditioned. They have average IQ, so where they were able to be socially connected, and they were able to be, infused with the concepts and the popular ideas in the society. And because of that, they are like sheeple they become, and they basically follow what everyone else does because the schooling process has brainwashed them into a certain way of thinking, believing, and living. So they always first use dominant culture to tell them how to behave, right? Which is to say, certain things they just follow without thinking. That's the primary modus operandi for an average IQ, EQ person. Now, the second thing, it'll go in between them using their average intellect / EQ or them using primitive instincts. These two things are constantly at war for the average IQ person, and they're battling between which one to use. Sometimes they use their average IQ and sometimes they just go with what they feel. This is why you have situations where young people out at a party, they're drinking and a guy takes advantage of a female when he knows she's not quite sober, but he's feeling quite horny. And so he uses his primitive instinct, which overwhelms his average IQ, and then he makes a bad decision. Now, this is something that occurs because the dominant culture was a culture of alcohol consumption, right? You consume alcohol in a party environment. So once they've first obeyed the dominant culture, now they're inebriated. Now that they're inebriated, their IQ, which is average, and their primitive instincts, which are pretty strong, are at battle, and then the primitive instincts overcome because they've already been liquored up. So that's what happens to the average person. That's why they end up regularly making decisions that are disadvantageous, not only in the sexual realm, but many other realms. That's why average people achieve average things, because they're mostly sabotaging themselves through their own, ineffective intellect, or them following the dominant culture. And the dominant culture is not designed for you to move up. The dominant culture is designed for you to be a good factory worker, an obedient citizen. The problem with the dominant culture globally is that it's not a good, positive, morally upright culture. Now, carrying on to the high IQ people. High IQ people, they first use their IQ / EQ. Now, this is like a small percentage of the human population. This is less than, 15% of the population. These are approximations. They first look at every situation and they think through it using intelligence and emotional intelligence. Why? Because their life experience has told them that they have a strong ability to analyze and understand the world. And so they try to interpret the world and make a decision that will be best for them as an individual, because they're more inclined to see things clearly. So their first instinct is to use high, superior intellect. Their second instinct is to use dominant culture to make decisions. Why? High IQ people with high IQ and high EQ together, these people are going to use the dominant culture secondly, because they have been through school, and what school actually is a tool of power holders, whether it's the government or the wealthiest class of society. The schooling system is a formal mechanism for implanting ideas, traditions, life ways, and beliefs into the individual. And so because high IQ, EQ people have successfully went through school, they've went through this enculturation process all the way through the PhD level in some cases. So they very much so are going to follow dominant culture unless they are a unique outlier personality or have an extraordinarily high EQ, emotional intelligence, which gives them the wherewithal to go against the grain. Lastly, they're going to follow their primitive instincts, because the high EQ people, the high IQ people are the civilized people mostly. And when they do follow their primitive instincts, they're intelligent enough to cover over it with something else, some other veneer, so that they don't look so savage. These are people you really got to pay attention to. Now, here's the thing. Out of 100 people in the society, you'll have a situation where, say, like 8 are below average IQ, another 8 are well above average IQ. So you got the people who are imbeciles and the people who are geniuses. And then the overwhelming majority of humankind is this 85% in the middle, most people that you encounter on a regular basis. These are the people who follow culture, right? Now, the reason that it's important for us to improve culture, because if we have a culture of alcoholism, a culture of sexual freedom that leads to perversion, that leads to lonely mothers, that leads to broken families, it's occurring here, and they're producing broken children. And when you have broken children, which are occurring in mass numbers, these are the people who create the sick, low society that you and I have to exist in. Whether we're high IQ, average IQ, or low IQ, we all are going to suffer because the majority of the culture, the majority of the people are thinking and living in broken, downtrodden ways. And that is why we have to reform the culture. This is what I mean. If the dominant culture tells you to go out and party, and you go out and party and get drunk, then you use your primitive instincts and you either end up doing something foolish on a sexual level with a female, or you say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just drive home, which is another stupid idea. And you drive home drunk and end up hitting and killing someone. This rooted at a top level from the dominant culture. It was not an individual decision that led you to be at a party where there was significant alcohol consumption. You did that because that's what 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds do in America. Conversely, say America was a society that was not so permissive in terms of alcoholism. We said you have the option, it's a free society, but we're a society of health. We're a society of intellectualism. We're a society of physical health. So instead of going out and getting shit-faced, we're going to have you go out and enjoy and have dance, have music, socialize, but stay sober. You see, then you're not going to have the ramifications of idiotic decisions occurring from average IQ people or people with average to low IQ or EQ. So that's why culture is so important, because it's going to affect the decisions it's going to affect the behaviors that occur, because the average person is mostly not making decisions. They're just doing what everyone else does. So when you're controlling culture, you're controlling what the average person is inclined to do, which should be, physical health, exercise, reading, working hard, being timely, being saintly, being friendly to people you encounter, wanting to lend a hand. These are the things that we need to be infusing into the dominant culture. I hope that was not too deep or complex. I just want to give you a sense of the reason that we're engaging on our work. And you might say, well, Mark, what about religion? Well, religion is fantastic, except that it doesn't work. For the most part, I've met very few Christians who have read more of the Bible than I have. I've read it cover to cover, Old Testament and New Testament, and I'm not even a Christian, but most people who say they are haven't read it. Same thing with Muslims. Quran's much shorter, but most Muslims haven't read it. You're supposed to pray 5 times a day. Most of them don't pray 5 times a day. You're supposed to memorize the Quran. They got a whole lifetime. Muslims are 30, 40 years old. They don't even have 5 surahs memorized. It's not applicable to the average person, and the average person is not very much so spiritually inclined. So what we're doing is creating a hyper simplified mode of conduct that will be easy for the average person to consume, understand, and practice. And the SaSN is here as a body to help nourish those behaviors and regulate when people are out of line. Saints, I know this is complex stuff, but I just had to, let you in on this. Do comment below. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I've missed anything. Let us end this the way we always end this, with the creed of the SaSN. Repeat after me with full conviction, knowing that this is true of you. I am going to be who I truly am, because I am remarkable. And I'm going to strive every moment to show the greatest part of who I am. Until next time.